board members, I will first and foremost tell you that it is my fault for not having put out the minutes for the last meeting. So we will not be up for a vote. I will ensure that those are tabulated for both of these meetings and provided prior to the agenda for the next one, so they can be approved in form at that point. I will tell you, I've got a little presentation here today, but I hope for this time that we spend together today is actually a little more conversational as we begin to think about, for those of you that saw the agenda, kind of some of the recommendations that you may have already talked about, or some of the questions that you had for additional research, recommending things to City Council. The CBAC, as we'll discuss, kind of usually has recommendations for their regular work plan as well as for the budget. I've shown you the trial balanced budget and kind of a draft of some of what City Council had seen from a capital perspective. That will be officially presented on May 31st, the manager's proposed budget to Mayor and City Council. So we'll talk about the timing of the next meeting here and when you'd like that to happen, can give you a presentation and maybe solidify some recommendations on that. As the chair and or vice chair usually come to Finance Committee in mid-June and do a little 5 minutes summarizing their kind of work plan and any recommendations related to the work plan or the budget. And that meeting at the Finance Committee should be, and I'll go back and check, and Frank could check me on this, but it should be on June the 13th or 14th. I'd have to go back and look. We do have with us today, and I will share my screen here in just a little bit, Frank Elliott. I'll make that introduction. He's acting as the city's interim marketing and communications director. We were supposed to have our former director, Ed McNeil, with us, but unfortunately just not able to make it. So Frank has come up to speed very quickly on what we'll be discussing, but we talked about on last week's agenda, looking at some of our how we marketed the 2 grant cycles that the city has put out, as well as some storytelling opportunities. And so Frank and I will do some tag teaming on how we have marketed those and advertised those throughout the city. And we'll give you some feedback even on things we've heard from individuals about some of how we've done this. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and go through kind of work plan agenda and into those slides. I can remove that at any time. If everybody wants to see each other, just let me know. I hope that everyone is seeing a PowerPoint presentation. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you are. All right, perfect.
Yes.
I struggle sometimes with it in presentation mode in Zoom. I'm not sure why. So I'm going to leave it. You can still see the advanced slides on the left, but hopefully everybody can see this in the size that it's at. So again, at a high level, we want to talk about the work plan for CBAC. As far as ARPA, or the American Rescue Plan Act, is concerned, those bullet points are the specific areas that we had culled out in the work plan to look at for potential recommendations. Not to say that you couldn't pick up on any others, but they were related to the actual framework or programming uses of the $51.7 million. Discussions
you switched to your email accidentally.
Yeah, it looks like we just got it. Yeah.
Are we back?
Yes.
That's because I shared the screen and not the file. There we go. Sorry about that. We'll keep it on that screen for this point. So the second piece there, the timing, as we've discussed, all money has to be obligated by December 31st, 2024 and spent by December 31st, 2026. There are some conversations to be had about kind of the period of performance for any subrecipients that we have in terms of spending that money. And so it would be very useful to have that conversation a little bit later about kind of the timeline and any recommendations there. Administrative capacity, we've talked about a couple of times. Right now, Meredith Martin, who I don't believe on the call right now, and I are tag teaming this, but there are 2 additional positions in budget that are currently vacant, have been advertised for. We're lining up interviews for one of them. And over in housing, they're actually hiring a few new positions. You'll see them in the budget to help with additional funding from ARPA that's being used for housing development. So if you wanted to make recommendations around administrative capacity, we can, again, talk about that this afternoon, answer any questions you have, and see what falls out there. Obviously going to talk about marketing and outreach a little bit today with Frank, and the public reporting piece was specific to external dashboards, and I also have that to talk about later as well. We talked about operating and capital budgets. Those the manager's proposal will come out later this month. We can revisit anything that was in the presentation last month with respect to the trial balance budget or potential LOBS packages. But that will be officially recommended from the city manager to the mayor and city council at the end of the month. And we will release it to you as soon thereafter as we can. So again, today we'll talk with Frank. We'll talk about some program updates, things that city council has touched in the last 3 or 4 weeks since we last talked. And then spend a hefty portion of the day kind of culling through if there are specific areas where you think you would like to address something with city council, giving staff the opportunity to draft that in narrative form for you to come back at a future meeting and approve those. So without further ado, we'll just kind of jump into the marketing and advertising component of this. So the first page here, I'm going to talk generally about what the city has done and some of the things that budget and performance management have been managing very heavily with the assistance of marketing and communication. But there is a website, obviously multiple web pages related to ARPA. We have not only web pages for our $51.7 million and the individual programs that fall under that, but Frank could tell you, have also done a good bit of posting information generally about what was available to the community otherwise. Many things that even weren't in ARPA, like PPP, and which is the Paycheck Protection Program, all those other CARES Act and federal appropriations. So we did have a listing of that. So we have a lot of information on our city website, have gotten some feedback. And would encourage you, go out to the city's website, take a look at that information, provide us any feedback. If you think it needs to be consolidated in a different way, I'm more than happy to come back at our next meeting and kind of talk about your experience with how we've put that information out there. But we have a lot of information available on the website. We do have monthly ARPA updates. We actually had one earlier today. It was only attended by 3 people. We have had as many as 57 people, I believe, attending the ones in the past where we were specifically talking about grant opportunities. I believe when we're talking about giving money away, people like to show up. And when we're just talking generally about what's happening, there is not as much civic engagement there, but we do monthly meetings. Have obviously brought things, action items and information items before the city council and its committee structure multiple times. For our grant opportunities, we also have a 501c3 distribution list. So anyone who has ever requested funding from the city for that's a nonprofit, we keep a list of them here in budget. And for any of these grant opportunities available to nonprofits, we sent a full email blast to that list of more than 300 individuals. If you're not familiar with our community assistance liaisons, each council member or group of council members is assigned someone to basically work as their proxy in the community to get the word out about things that are happening in each ward. So we worked with the community assistance liaisons to distribute information. And then through direct partnerships with WSB, or what most folks would call the local chamber of commerce, the Forsyth Tech Small Business Center, the Arts Council, who has a very far reach with the arts community and many partnerships, as well as the local Black Chamber of Commerce that does a lot with small businesses and minority businesses as well. So that's kind of the general distribution when we have our programs and we're getting information out, how we've put that information out. Frank is going to talk a little more specifically about the Recovery Grants Program, which was that $3 million for small businesses and small nonprofits who were in arrears on rent, mortgage, and utilities, and also our Transformative Grants process, which was that more transformative opportunity for a nonprofit to suggest a program or capital project in the community that would have a longer reaching impact. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank and let him kind of talk very specifically about our kind of advertising campaign for these and get in the weeds. Y'all feel free to ask him any questions you want.
How do you do, and good afternoon. Let me preface my remarks by saying that when all this was put together, I was the content creator and not the mastermind behind this, but I will gladly take responsibility for what we have wrought here in marketing. As you can see, we did a series of news releases, essentially with every turn of the screw, as we like to say. We put out a news release kind of keeping people posted on what was going on. City Edition is an electronic newsletter that city residents can subscribe to, and we had articles about the recovery grants opportunity rather in October, December, January, and February. basically this is all pegged to when there were things going on that were relevant. We did a robust paid advertising effort for the recovery grants marketing effort because it was this was aimed at small businesses, and we wanted to reach them. We weren't as sure that they would be as plugged in as the nonprofits certainly are. And so we did a mailer, we did quarter page newspaper ads in the Chronicle and the Journal. We did radio ads, we did LinkedIn ads, we did Facebook ads, and then we did a host of media posts, as you can see. These are not one-time posts. Each one of these dates represents a separate post that was posted numerous times on our social platforms, and those social platforms are Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also do Nextdoor, but we are judicious in what we put on Nextdoor because Nextdoor is really more about residential matters, and so we did not post this on Nextdoor. We get feedback from the Nextdoor people that they don't want us spamming their accounts with everything. They just want us to send them things that are relevant to neighborhoods, and so we did not do Nextdoor for that. For the transformation grants, we did a series of news releases, and you can see what they were basically about. Of course, the transformative grants was later out the chute. It didn't get really approved. I think it was to what? Was that February, Scott?
Yeah.
So once it was approved, we got something in the next 2 issues of City Edition. We put advertisements in City Now. City Now is a half-page ad that we put in the Journal and the Chronicle on the first Sunday and the first Thursday, respectively, of the month. And basically, it's a compilation of smaller ads. And so we carved out some space in that to promote the transformative grants. And then you can see we also did a series of social posts about that. And we did not do a paid campaign for the transformative grants program because I believe Ed, our previous marketing director, and talking it over with Scott, we felt that the city has such a good handle on who the nonprofits are that we didn't need a broad outreach effort, and we would conserve our funds.
Yeah, we'll piggyback on that, Frank. We have outside of this, we do have a normal community agencies process where any nonprofit in the city is allowed to request funding. And so this was kind of a supplement for many of them to our normal annual process. We saw many of the same faces, but I will say by the same stretch, the advertising that we did do, getting the word out through city council, through community assistance liaisons on this one, we did get a lot more applications from 501c3s that we've not seen before. I will tell you, as the pending date for the application closure came, Meredith and I probably spent 4 hours a day for several days answering emails and talking on the phone with grant writers and different administrative personnel in some of those nonprofit agencies. So the word definitely got out there, and we're definitely inundated by what is this? How do we apply? And a series of technical questions around the application itself. So I do think, at least on the transformative side, that even without that paid advertising, the word still was very effective in getting out. Tony, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, I just a question following up on that. For those nonprofit groups that maybe are new to that line of communication, did you notice any sort of grouping or trend in kind of regional location type of nonprofit and mission, or any reason why they might not have previously been, other than newness, kind of on the radar?
So I will say we'll have to go back and pull. So the application process just closed last Monday, and we've not pulled them by ward or location. Essentially, at this point, we're still kind of getting through assigning those out for review so that we can get the scoring done. I will tell you, a lot of the new nonprofits that we get are very often small nonprofits. We don't get very large nonprofits to come out of nowhere or new chapters to pop up. I would say a lot of the calls that we got for new faces to us were ones in areas we may not typically as a city function. I will tell you, healthcare and mental health care are 2 areas where we took a lot of phone calls. Historically, those are what we would consider to be kind of county functions. The county is charged by state statute in dealing with healthcare and mental health care, but they are areas that we are starting to transition into. And so we did get a number of calls in those areas. I will say we also I think we saw an influx, particularly with where city council is in its strategic planning process, with those talking about housing, affordable housing, if not development, but also working with homeless populations and transitional housing. So I think just anecdotally, I would say those are probably the two service areas where we saw more of the questions and more new faces that we don't typically see. I can go back and pull those by location and see if there is a difference in what we get from the annual process through this process in terms of the location of it, but probably we're honestly more worried about not the location of the 501c3 as we are the location of the recipients who they're working with. This process at the onset was developed from a transformational nature within the ARPA guidelines related to those qualified census tracts or the lower areas of town, lower income areas of town. So would hope that even more so than our annual process, that those that are being served are in some of those areas that are in greater need. Frank, anything else we need to touch on there, advertising, marketing wise, for those kind of grants programs?
Not that I can think of, except of course our support is ongoing with every monthly update session that you have. We promote those as they come along.
Okay. Feel free to again chime in at any point. I'm going to move us along to the next slide, which is kind of more, instead of talking about what we've done in marketing, thinking about kind of the future, and we've started to spend some of this ARPA money, but how do we start to tell that story? I'm going to let Frank kind of chime in here on what we may have done in the past with other things, and set up what we could do, and then really we'll look for some recommendations after Frank heads out and we have a more thorough talk about what you might want to see in terms of the city telling its own success story.
So yeah, what we have done in the past, we like to do what we call proof of performance videos and social posts. And so in this case, what we mean by that is we want to be showing the citizens and the taxpayers that in fact we're doing what we say we're going to do. So we come out and we say we're going to offer these grants. We should come back, of course we will do a news release saying who gets the grants, but then we want to flesh that out by highlighting select grant recipients for some sort of in-depth treatment of how they've used the money, how they use their grant, and how it has helped our citizens. In this case, ARPA-wide, of course, we'll talk not only about the grant programs, but the affordable housing is a big element of what the city council is interested in. So we'll be highlighting that as that works out. And as specific programs come to our attention that merit attention, that merit some publicity, we'll give them the same treatment that we plan to do for our grant recipients. But typically what we do is we'll do a little video. It'll be a 2 to 3 minute video that we can put on our social media. We also put it on our YouTube channel, and it might be interviewing the grant people, the organization, might be interviewing some of the recipients, the beneficiaries of the grant and of the program that the organization created with the grant. And we will post those then on all our platforms, and that's basically what we do. Occasionally, well, I shouldn't say occasionally, but also we will typically put it on our channel, on our TV13 channel. But with the fragmentation of the audience now that we have streaming, there's fewer and fewer people actually watching TV13. But our YouTube channel and social media is proving to be an even better way to reach our citizens, and that's what we're using. Scott, is there anything else you want me to talk about?
No, I mean, I think it's an opportunity for the group here if they would like to ask you if they have any specific questions or can discuss later, if there are specific programs they think are more important to highlight for this, or if they've seen things that other cities are doing. There are some cities that got out on the fore end of spending money a lot more quickly than we did. We've been taking a little more exercise in strategic patience and understanding how these monies can be used. But if you've seen anything else, feel free to let us know. Have any questions? But Frank, I think you've kind of hit that for your end. And unless the group has any more questions for you, we'll let you squirrel back away to the million other things that we are marketing currently.
I do appreciate that. And just committee members, if you have any questions that you think of later, please let Scott know, and I know he'll get in touch with me.
Thank you, Frank.
would say there, Frank has been working with us very, very heavily. Appreciate all of his work and with staff. We will, again, continue all of these marketing efforts. And if you have any questions about, well, why are you not doing this? We'll definitely pass those along to Frank and staff as well. I would ask that generally, is there something you expected to see in the city's advertising or marketing strategies there that you didn't see? Anything new and innovative that you'd like us to try? I'm always open to new activities and ventures. Frank might shoot me because I don't give him the budget for it, but we'll see what we can do.
So, Scott, I do have a question about how we're telling the story of the results of those receiving the grants. Have we ever started from the beginning as to why? So let's say we're interviewing a grant recipient, as to why they applied for the grant, from the beginning to the middle to the end as a result, to tell the entire story instead of a degree of the story to the public?
Frank, I'll let you answer that
Yeah.
one.
So the shorter answer is yes, we do that, but also we recognize these days that people have no patience for long videos.
Well, you do it in segments.
We can do that. We can do longer versions on our channel. Social media, we really try to keep things fairly tight because people will click out of a video.
Yes.
As you probably know from your own experience.
True.
When you're browsing something, you're going to look at it for 5 seconds. If it doesn't catch you, you're clicking out and moving on to the next thing. And that's the world we live in these days. So we can tell the long story, but when we try to do our social media versions, we really want to hone in on just the most important part of it. We're not trying to make them an expert in everything this organization does. We're just trying to tell their story of how they helped people. And indirectly how the city helped people by giving them that grant.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
If not, Frank, I'm going to move on down the agenda for us and talk about review of the framework and kind of updates that City Council. And I do believe we have another member with us. Jamesina, are you there? I just clicked on admit for her. It had popped up on my third screen and I didn't see it. I don't know how long she's been waiting.
Yes,
hopefully
I'm here.
Hopefully it hasn't been too long. Sorry, if I got 3 screens and I just looked over and happened to see that it popped up over there. I hope you haven't been waiting too long.
Not too long. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Jamesina was recommended or approved by the mayor and city council just last week. So she'll be a new member with us. We will continue through the program. I know that she is kind of working and watching in the background at the same time for a conversation we had earlier. So we'll, if she has time at the end, allow her to do a kind of little introduction, but we'll keep steaming along here. The next thing, like I said, I want to do is talk about kind of the framework updates. So I'm going to show this in the same area or in the same visual that we did last month and talk about a couple of differences in the highlighted areas. So again, council has set aside $20 million for housing investments. We are generally talking about that as affordable housing, either development or redevelopment. The change, and it's not really a change in the framework, but in the use here, is that City Council committed $4.5 million of this $20 million to be used for the phase 2 program funding gap for the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which is kind of on the eastern side of town, the Liberty Street corridor, Old Cleveland Avenue area homes. So we are still using that $20 million for affordable housing. However, that it's being used in a redevelopment purpose. I would encourage all of the members of CVAC and the general public to go back and kind of review some of the information at a high level. What we've been told is that there is a roughly $48 million gap for that Choice Neighborhoods Initiative project. The total budget for it, I'm gonna ballpark this, is probably in the $120, $130 million range. The city originally had about $6 million in it with a $48 million gap. I think all of the partners are kind of stepping back from the table, trying to reassess, what our resources are and what our role is in those future phases. I believe it's a 5-phase project. The next phase, I believe, has a $16 million gap, and then so on and so on. So we're going to be talking with the federal government, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who had $30 million in this project. If they can come back to the table with us, they have increased the maximum award amount for future years from 30 to 50 million. And so we're kind of hopeful that there's an opportunity to get some more money from the feds. But there is a pretty significant gap going forward in that project. But again, only 4.5 million at this point of that 20 has been allocated to that project. But there is an opportunity in the future, potentially for that money to be used for that purpose in future gaps. Probably a good area to talk about here in terms of recommending whether or not, you think this money should be used for that project, for development or redevelopment purposes, or at least provide some commentary on, as much as possible, if that's what the CBAC thinks, that this should be used for development of new affordable housing rather than redevelopment. I know that's a very important project, has been on our radar for a very long time, but just kind of get some feedback on that one. We again have it on the agenda to talk about later, but if somebody wants to jump in and kind of talk about that, I'm more than happy to take those notes down.
I have a quick
Sure,
question.
I would like to. Go ahead, Fred. Go ahead. Okay.
Well, my question, I'll get it out. If it's a $48 million hole, what's the chances of it just failing completely?
So I am probably not the best person to substantially answer that question. In terms of a complete failure, I don't think a complete failure is an option. It is phased in. And so I think if there were to be a funding failure at some point, there would be maybe one of the phases that gets pushed further out because funding's not available at that time. I do know this is an area that not just the city council, but our delegation in Congress is very worried about this project as well. So we are hopeful that there are additional resources coming for that. That is kind of a to be determined thing. No one wants it to fail. And so I do think all of the partners want to come, and it's going to be a question of what commitments can those partners make, and the development firm, McCormick Barron Salazar, that's doing it. How much more skin are they going to have in the game as the private developer kind of managing this project? All of those are conversations that are going to keep happening probably for the next several years. So would love in the next couple of years to keep having this conversation on CBAC with you. But the short answer is nobody wants it to fail. But if there ultimately were, I think it would be a future phase being pushed back for some period of time. Hey, Seta?
Yeah, so that was not my question. It was similar, but so which phase are we in now? Is we still in phase 1, or going into 2, or 2 going into 3?
We are in phase 1 going into the pre-development for phase 2, where they are, it's my understanding that they are making the official requests to HUD and lining up the financing and design pieces. I would have to get Marla for the exact schedule, and I can get that for you of when each phase is supposed to start and technically be completed. But right now we are in phase 1 and we have not begun phase 2 yet.
Okay, so since we are still in phase 1, correct me if I'm wrong, you said you were looking for the possibility of moving forward with new development or reconstruction development. And if I'm understanding the area of Winston that we're talking about restoring, to me, I don't see why, I just don't see I don't see it making good business sense to restore units that are over 50 years old and it's not considered the historical part of Winston, even under the Black section of town or the white section of town. It's not considered historic. So why would we renovate buildings or housing that needs to be done over? Why would we invest money into property that's not earmarked as historical?
So for the Choice Neighborhoods project itself, the term renovation maybe underselling what's actually happening for a majority of that project. Most of those
Okay.
buildings are going to be razed to the ground and then completely rebuilt.
Okay.
I do not know which structures may be kind of just taken down to the studs and rebuilt up if they've still got good foundations, but I know that the way those phases are built are to relocate people, demolish, rebuild, and put them back over the course of 5 phases. So there's a lot of relocation effort that goes on in kind of deconstructing what's there to build back better. It's not just a renovation project. It really is a complete transformation of that area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The question I think out there on our minds is when this frame, if I was talking to you about this framework a year ago, I would have said that $20 million is to develop new affordable housing.
Okay.
And now that we've got this $48 million choice neighborhoods gap, the question now is, well, could a substantial portion of that money just be eaten up in no net new units? We're redeveloping that area, but it doesn't increase the supply of affordable housing, and you could potentially spend tens of millions of dollars doing that. And so would be appropriate for CBAC to kind of chime in on the preference for new housing development versus redevelopment with these funds.
Okay.
And again, I've got a slide on that, so we can definitely, I will force that conversation here in about 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll wait.
Yeah. In terms of the programs that have already been funded, that is really the only kind of major thing that council did. Again, that was a commitment, not an obligation. And the difference there being going into stage 2, the developer is lining up their ducks and submitting their applications for funding. We had to commit to the gap. Assuming everything goes forward, we would then come back later and actually appropriate those funds, budget for those funds for the project. So it's kind of committed, but not completely obligated at this point. And if something else were to change and we were to get more federal money, we may be able to use that money for something else. But on paper,
Okay.
it's committed. Moving down to the part of the framework where we kind of haven't really obligated or spent the money yet, had a couple of upgrades. Wanted to talk to you, or updates I want to talk to you about on the digital divide side. Every time we've talked about digital divide, it's been, we thought we were going to be able to do infrastructure and we can't. The Forsyth County Digital Equity Commission submitted a draft to staff of the types of things they would like to request funding for. And none of it includes infrastructure build out because they can't do that with city funds. We'll tell you it was roughly $2 million, and what they have talked about are digital literacy programs, essentially, and providing equipment and network capability to residents in need. So they are still, it's a draft at this point. I think they're still working on finalizing an application, but wanted to give you a heads up from a staff perspective that the Digital Equity Commission is looking at requesting 2 million of that 5 million. They would be doing programming out of city recreation centers. That would be general digital literacy, but they would also have specific programs for coding and for some other job-related activities. And I believe it was 1,250 individuals that they would get into the program would all get basically a Chromebook, some sort of equipment to be able to access the internet where they are. So more to come on that, but just kind of the heads up of that there, as we've discussed, that may be an area where we don't spend the full $5 million. It's more and more starting to turn in that way unless city council wants to really push that envelope. That may be an area where we recycle some money back into the framework. The last piece I've highlighted here at the bottom, we have additional admin and other. On a spreadsheet way back on a drive somewhere, we had something for other that has started to come to fruition. And after June, assuming council approves it, will start to show up on this framework separately. At Public Safety Committee, just last night, Assistant City Manager Patrice Toney talked about what she called the BEAR model, which is would be a behavioral evaluation and response team. But if you've heard the co-response or alternative response for mental and behavioral health calls in terms of law enforcement response, we have set aside kind of on paper $700,000 for the implementation of that in year 1 costs associated with it. So that would come out of that roughly $1.65 million would come down to roughly 900,000. Again, City Council has not approved that. I think they will formally approve the program if they choose to do so in June. So we would see it separately next month in a framework. Those are kind of the only updates and changes that have happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks since we've last spoken. Does anybody have any, and I'll kind of scroll back to page 1 or 2 of this. Does anybody have any general questions about the framework or anything they've heard or seen or wanted to ask any additional questions there? Otherwise, we'll kind of start talking about draft recommendation areas with ARPA and spillover. Yeah, Fred.
I just have a quick question. The eviction diversion seems really tiny compared to everything else. Was there a reason why?
It's because that's what was requested.
Okay.
Yeah. I wondered that myself. It is really set up as even not a multi-year, just a 1-year program. It's working with legal aid, and they were going to hire an attorney and I believe maybe a paralegal or an admin assistant of some kind. And we are splitting the costs, I believe, with another organization or the county. So it's not even the cost of an attorney and a paralegal. It's only part of that cost. So we are partnering with a couple of other organizations to fund that. I would also say this was related to the eviction moratorium, and don't know that this was expected to be a long-term thing, kind of be on the books for a year, really get through a backlog of eviction issues, and then do an evaluation of whether or not it would have to be funded going forward. But yeah, it was based on the request, not on us putting it out there. Anything else more generally? I know we've kind of kicked this dead horse 3 or 4 times in the last couple of meetings, and hopefully have put out the details. If not, I'll sit back here. There are recorded in the minutes some areas that we have talked about, programmatic recommendations or areas where we would like to talk about it. And so I'm going to kick this conversation off on the first slide here, just talking about the overall framework. And then in light of, and I will tell you, there are probably several $1 million in some of those programs that are not going to be spent in those programs. If they're not spent there, where would CBAC recommend from a service area? Where do you think the highest need is, or would provide direction to City Council? Should it be in more nonprofit programs? Should it be more in housing because we have housing needs that are popping up? Kind of would love to get some feedback from the group there.
So, Scott, so the funds that are not used, can they also, is it possible to transfer those funds into the city services like recycling? Since we're now going to be paying for that service and not outsourcing it, is that possible?
The answer to that question is a very technical maybe. And I would tell you it violates one of the principles of ARPA in that would be using one-time money to cover ongoing operating costs.
Okay.
So you can very well recommend, I'll give you the specifics and technicals on this. We talked about we do those calculations every year, and I would have to bring up one of the prior presentations, but there was roughly $32 million of that we were allowed to call lost revenue per the calculation that Treasury let us do.
Right.
Once that money is called lost revenue, it comes over to fund balance and then can be used for any governmental purpose. So the answer is yes, it could be used for recycling, but of that 32 million, there's only about 5.2 million left. 20 million of it went directly to housing, and 5.5 million of it went to shore up parking, occupancy tax, ballpark, those funds
right.
that we talked about great need. So yes, if CBAC wanted to, you could recommend kind of propping an annual budget up with some of that money, but it would be kind of using that outside of the framework. But that's absolutely a recommendation you could make. Sure.
Okay. Just a question. I don't want I don't like technical responses. I like to stay within the framework.
City Council doesn't like the technical response either. We'll keep it at a high level for them as well and explain. Essentially, though, the crux of that would be it's using one-time funding to balance a ongoing operational expense.
Right.
We, from a professional staff perspective, try to steer away from that. but can definitely have that conversation. And if you wanted to make that recommendation, kind of give you the budget speak on how you would do that.
Okay.
So
Okay.
so I have a question. So the affordable housing funds. So I know that that's a need in Winston. So if some of that money that wasn't going to be spent was spent in that area, are there like known one-time uses already out there, like projects that are that would be easily to go, or would there have to be some time and effort spent on identifying new projects?
Housing specifically, or just general projects?
Housing specifically.
So I think there are one or two kind of in the hopper right now that we're looking at specific areas. I could have our community development director or someone from CD come back and kind of talk to you about that. If you're thinking there are 8 or 10 in the hopper and we could just do that really quickly, that is not the case right now. We do have a couple that we're working with. We will be letting a contract with the School of Government. For those of you that aren't familiar with the UNC School of Government, there are just a slew of attorneys that work at UNC Chapel Hill in a specific school that is aimed at nothing but helping local governments and state government interpret and interpret state law and local ordinances and put things into action. So we actually have a contract with some of the development folks over there to help us look at how to market and get the appropriate uses on potentially 2 properties, the one that the city has purchased and one that the city is thinking about purchasing. So Fred, there aren't just a whole bunch of them to grab from. That money would be spent over time as developers come to us and as we purchase property and specifically write RFPs to developers to develop.
So then if I understand you right, that would probably not be a good recommendation to put money there just because there aren't enough projects.
Let me not say it that way. I think what you would get is we would use more of that money to provide a subsidy to developers and incentivize them to come to us for those projects. So what we have right now, we're kind of in a planning phase on the best way to spend this money. As we get into an implementation phase, adding money to that pot would most likely be used to purchase land to subsidize development or directly subsidize development at a higher level and advertise that we're willing to do so.
Related to that, Scott, I wonder if there is existing language or if there could be then for subsidized development projects, either from existing public land sold or land acquired by the city, a way to pin a certain number of affordable housing units to those agreements. Because, going back to that question about new housing versus redevelopment, don't have the numbers in front of me, but visually, anecdotally, right, we are adding housing units citywide, but there is, to my knowledge, no direct pinning of affordable housing numbers to non-affordable housing units that are already in development or that have been developed. So going back to that kind of debate versus new housing versus redevelopment, one of the things that I would love to see at some point is a breakdown of the total planned units that we are aware of in the next, even if it's in the next fiscal year or 5 years, versus the current plan for adding a total number of affordable units to those, or kind of the total redevelopment. So in short, I would like to see a comparison of those numbers, regular housing versus affordable housing, and then kind of in reflection on that, be able to have some recommendations that are based on kind of either a dearth of affordable housing units or kind of redeploying those subsidies or that money in a way that balances it a little better.
Sure. So I'll respond to that in a couple of ways. One, you have asked almost exactly what a council member asked for this week in terms of reporting either monthly or quarterly on how this funding is getting used and the number of units we are developing or redeveloping with city funding. As a performance metric, what budget kind of where we come in on that is we're thinking about the average subsidy per unit. So if I've got $20 million and I want my average subsidy to be $20,000 per unit, how many units can I create out of that? The policy side of that is the city does not and cannot make a developer create affordable housing when it's completely theirs. But when they ask us for money, they are absolutely subject to the terms that we put on it. Council has just recently updated policies related to this. And it talks about the number of affordable housing units you must have, the number of workforce housing units you must have. So that is in terms of AMI, below 60% AMI and 60 to 120% AMI. One of the things that does change in some of those contracts, and even this would have been presented, there is the Peters Creek initiative, it's PCCI, I don't know what the other C is, but there's a group that is currently looking to get low housing income tax credit funding and use some city funding to create affordable units. When you go through that process, there is a designation for how long those units are marked as affordable when they're created. And sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes it's 30 years, sometimes it's 50, and every once in a while it's 99 or in perpetuity. And so there are a few moving pieces to that, but the city council has actually put a little pen to paper there, Tony, and we will get you kind of the information on the policy side of that, but that is definitely something that we have minimum thresholds for when we have skin in the game, that they have to provide that. You can't come to us with, I'd like $500,000 and I'd like to go build some $1 million homes out on Meadowlark or something like that. So,
yeah, ultimately my question is then, given that, right, in the level, I mean, it's a little more reactive rather than proactive. Is there space then to be a little more proactive?
and that goes back, yeah, that goes back to Fred's question. I think what you'll see is with this pot of money, we're going to try and be more proactive. We're going to be advertising to the developers. You know, we're willing to, don't come to us with your idea because you just have 5 or 10 units in there. You know, we're going to be out on the front end talking about, we'd love for 30% of your development to be affordable in terms of that mixed income use. And we're willing to, you know, to put a couple of $1 million on the table, depending on how many, you know, units you're willing to give us. I think all of that backs into that. Raleigh just did a very, or it's either Raleigh or Wake County, I can't remember, did a plan, and they wanted their average subsidy per affordable unit to be no greater than, I think, $15,000 or $20,000. Construction markets are out of control right now, so that 15 or 20 probably easily has become 25 in 12 months. But we have done subsidies as low as $5,000 or $7,000 a unit and have done them as high as $60,000 a unit. So it really does vary. It is significantly more expensive to do it in more expensive areas. So if we want affordable housing for all throughout the community, the subsidies are generally higher in downtown and generally higher on what you would call the west side of town. So absolutely, but we'll get you the information on that that was provided to City Council.
So Scott, just if I hear that right, so from the 16 million, not counting the 4 million for the Cleveland, you were talking several hundred new houses.
That would be the hope, yes. Again, if it's used for redevelopment purposes, like in choice neighborhoods, then there will be essentially no net new homes created from that. In quick numbers, so we used a number of 25,000, and you also have to remember that the state gave us an additional $10 million in the state budget this year. So take the 20, net out the 4.5, you get 15.5, add the 10 million is 25.5.
That's right out of 1,000.
Yeah, so 25.5 million divided by that 25,000 per, 1,000 units. Hopefully we can get some of those units below the 25 number. That's not a magical thing. I think you might also see in future bond referenda higher numbers for affordable housing, potentially going out to the voters and saying, do you want to support higher levels of affordable housing production in the city? That is something in city council and committee meetings that several city council members have already put out there. So I'm not on the front edge of mentioning any of that publicly. Charlotte, obviously a much bigger jurisdiction than us, has put on general obligation referenda $50 million every other year is what they're going to put out there to the voters. It has passed 2 of the last 3 years. So they have done $100 million in affordable housing geo bonds in the span of 36 months. We're not quite Charlotte's size, so I don't know that we would entertain or have the resources to pay the debt on something that large. But yeah, that does get to how many units can you create? How many do you need? 1,000 is not going to meet the need, Tony. I think, how many do we really need? There was a housing study that said we needed 14,000 new homes. Those weren't all affordable, but if you assume that even half of that was in the affordable range, you'd be looking at 7,000 plus affordable housing units was what we needed a year or two ago, minus the, where we're at now. So generally, I'll come back to the idea or notion here. If we go back to the framework and think about this kind of at a high level, and I'll put this up there. If money was left over in digital divide or money was left over in social and economic assistance in any of these areas, and we were to reprogram it, would we say we think housing is one of the highest priorities for this? Would you say that there are other things? And going back to HESETA, reducing the tax rate, you could recommend that there be city strategies to try and use this money to reduce the tax rate. That could be done in a very small part, again, in a technical fashion, and it would be kind of a short-term fix. But this is kind of your opportunity to say, if we don't spend the money there, we really think it ought to be spent here.
And Scott, let me explain what I was saying about the tax rate, because as we are aware, of course, these funds came because of COVID. Mm-hmm. And COVID, our numbers seem to be going up again, and we're in the summertime. It's just 7 months before the end of the year. And I just don't think we should just sit back and wait to see how much higher the numbers are going to go up. And we find ourselves at the end of the year in the same place we were last year when it comes to people losing jobs and all these other trickle down effects from COVID replay itself. And we're speaking of raising taxes, raising this for 2023. So that's why I asked that question, if there was any way that we could offset some costs to our citizens for 2023, because none of us have that magic ball that we can look through and say, oh, COVID numbers are going to go down and we're no longer going to be in danger of this, that, or the other. So that was one of my main reasons for asking that question, and also hoping that we could find a way to offset some of the costs to our citizens when it comes to taxes, property taxes, whatever. Then my second concern is, I believe that with that in mind, I think housing investments is an area where funds should go. How much of the funds, I'm not sure, because I would like to see the same data that my colleague is asking for new housing versus the number of houses that would be redeveloped. Second, I think we should use or find a way to pay our our employees with the city. And not to say that community balance intervention programs, I'm an advocate for it, but not as strong as maybe some others that are on this panel, because it's going to take more than a one-time, two-time, or two-term event for violence prevention or interventions. I just don't think that we are going to nip it in the bud just by having an intervention for one group of people when we don't service the other group of people that may also be involved in the community violence. So those are my takes right now.
Okay, and I've recorded those things, and we'll kind of distill those down, create a narrative again to send out to the group to react to before the next meeting. I will say one of those is a bleed over. The reducing the tax rate or a tax rate increase can be both ARPA related as a recommendation and non-ARPA related in terms of CPAC. So y'all can say, hey, we could use a little bit of ARPA money to subsidize the tax rate in 1 year, knowing that as a one-time source, that means you may just be putting off a tax rate increase for a year. You could very well also, just as part of general budget, just say, hey, we don't think it's the time for a tax rate increase right now. Probably need to go back to the well and think about a different way to fund this budget. That either means cutting expenditures or looking at other revenue sources that we have. And again, I can get into the details of those too, but we'll kind of put that out there as both an ARPA and non-ARPA related potential recommendation for y'all to discuss.
Thank you, Scott.
Yes, ma'am. So I've got a couple areas there. I'll do one last call before we move on. Is there any other areas, something that's not on the framework where you think I've seen another city do this? Man, we should have spent money there. We should put more money in deferred maintenance. We should do more public art. We should do more transit services. We should do, just any of those areas. Tony, go ahead.
Street maintenance.
Yeah, I think you said it is right on it. I think one of the cool things about the Choice Neighborhoods initiative was that there was an effort to kind of not just improve a physical community on site, but also weave together the spaces where that community kind of intersects with the areas around it, building partnerships with local education institutions, right? The parks department, and building up the sidewalks and the green spaces in the area. I think that one of the places where I think it would be interesting to consider spending if there was additional funding left over from that housing initiative would be to looking at not just the housing specifically, but the infrastructure in and around those focuses of redevelopment or increased development. So kind of both parks and schools and connecting, right, that technology, right?
What about broadband internet?
The improvement
service?
for the technology infrastructure and literacy is a part of that housing. So we're not just kind of throwing money at units, but really dynamically looking at the neighborhoods where that money is going towards.
Absolutely. So I will we'll craft something that's probably going to be a little more vague in nature with respect to infrastructure development and maintenance in those areas. Ross, to get back to that broadband piece, again, the city does not have statutory authority to do broadband build out. No matter how badly we would want to, that is an area that we have been to this point prohibited from touching by state law. So bless you, Fred. Jay Messina, I saw you jumped on there. Did you want to chime in?
Yes, I would like to chime in quickly to say that to Ms. Schuler's point and also to Tony's point, I think that applying broken windows theory here to this situation, if there's going to be renovation of housing units in a particular area of the city, I think when Tony was speaking about some of those areas surrounding those units and the sidewalks and streets and green spaces and infrastructure, I think where Ms. Schuler was talking about like crime and violence intervention, which is also on the list, I truly believe that if some funds can be directed toward some of those areas around the units that are being redeveloped and reimagined, that would actually go a long way toward some crime and violence prevention, because as we all know, a lot of violent crime occurs in areas that are kind of what I would call neglected areas that look torn down, broken down. A lot of people don't walk through. They know that a lot of people are not there to witness because people don't hang out in areas that are less desirable. I really believe that if we can address some of the rest of the infrastructure around those communities, that actually would contribute toward the other line item. And then maybe some of those funds can be reallocated in that way. I think we should pay possibly allocate as much as we can toward that redevelopment issue, but not just the housing units. Thank you.
Yeah, to
Thank
piggyback
you.
a little bit, a more full integration initiative,
Yeah,
along with
I like
just
that.
building up of communities, right? Integrating communities, not necessarily just building up individual communities.
Right.
Agree.
Right.
Okay. I will, it was in the council's strategic plan, and there were some areas that were looked at, put some things in front of council, but didn't have a lot of funding for. Some of you are talking about this generally and have probably heard of the crime prevention through environmental design. And that's kind of what you're talking about, that whole broken window theory of, you can go and really do a lot in terms of infrastructure and cleaning up the area, reducing the amount of blight, and that has been shown and evaluated to have an influence in decreasing the amount of crime in a specific area. So,
Agree.
all right. Well, let me kind of peruse right along here, moving away from the overall framework and kind of fund reallocation into the transformational grants process itself. We obviously have ended that process, or application process ended last Monday. We received 89 applications totaling a little over $50 million, which quite frankly, I will tell you is significantly less than we expected. Some of our other peer jurisdictions have received more than 200 applications totaling over $200 million. So we're in a little bit lower of a volume than they are. City Council, has really created, and we showed you that framework that looks at alignment to strategic plan, capacity, needs, use and qualified census tracts, and so forth. But it would be well within kind of the parameters of CBAC in advance of council looking at those and making determinations to potentially say, we would really like, and these are the 2 bullet points here, 2 things that we've talked about. Are there specific areas that should be focused on, whether it's healthcare, mental health care, affordable housing, childcare? Are there specific kind of areas that you think the city council should focus on? And the other thing, and I believe Hezetta has brought it up multiple times, is trying to leverage the funds that both the county and the school system have gotten from ARPA, and really doing some kind of collaborative effort and being more intentional about having a more transformational project or program by working with multiple jurisdictions. So again, those can be kind of vague in nature, recommending to city council that there be sit downs, formal structured sit downs with the county and the school board, or very specific in terms of programs, if there are specific programs you like. Same thing with the key areas, could be kind of vague in terms of should really focus more on housing and reducing poverty, or it could be as specific as you want there. So just kind of wanted to, based on what I've heard before, get some feedback if you wanted to make a recommendation about those applications that have come in.
Scott, can you remind us how much money will be spent on this?
Sure. So what we've said on multiple occasions is that this $10.5 million can be available for that. We've not specifically looked at and said we're going to give it away. Also, as we discussed, there are a couple of programs that may be returning money to the framework, so that number could go higher in terms of availability. But would generally say $10 to $15 million is probably what's available for that.
So about a quarter of those grants could be funded roughly by volume of money.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And they do run the gamut of what areas they are in. There are several in the healthcare related area, several in housing, many in child services and kind of mentoring and tutoring and those kinds of areas. So we could get you a fuller list together of what's been submitted kind of by summary area, just to give you a heads up going into the next meeting. You could send that out with materials. But you could also talk very generally about if there are specific areas you thought these are where we should.
So I like what's been discussed by several people now about the whole idea of housing plus blight reduction to affordable housing plus blight reduction to reduce crime and improve housing. Of course, the obvious question, were there actually proposals that would enable that?
I would have to go, so there's a level of going through those. I've looked at kind of the program name and the amount and very high level cursory details. I don't remember seeing a whole bunch that are really kind of targeted blight reduction type things. Those are kind of capital specific things that they'd probably be expecting the city to really do the infrastructure. There are, again, some housing redevelopments that would kind of fall in that area, but that's really kind of the housing component, not the infrastructure around it. But we'll look and specifically see if there are any of those and kind of get back to you on that one.
It would be great, Scott, too, if there, let's say that there are not any proposals that address that issue. Is it possible that we can do another round of solicitation with funds that are more focused on collaborative efforts?
It is absolutely up to the city council what they
Okay.
fund. Of that $10 million that we're talking about, they could look at all 89 of these applications and say, that's not transformational to us. We're not spending a dime. And open up a separate, very focused, we only want to focus on,
Okay.
poverty reduction and blight reduction in these areas. They can do whatever they kind of please in that area. So,
All right. And finally, I would say that to your question or your recommendations, I
Mhm.
would suggest that we keep some of our recommendations as general as possible. That way it gives a little wiggle room to be more specific later on as we get into understanding the needs of the city.
I think that is generally a good idea with CBAC,
Okay.
to stay at a kind of higher level in terms of providing some general direction for city council. From the notes I've taken here, I mean, a lot of it has centered around infrastructure, in terms of development and redevelopment. So I think there's a lot of good information here for me to try to compile together and get back to y'all.
So Scott, when you send us sort of the information on those proposals, would it be possible to see the titles of the proposals, or is that too much information to ask for?
So I will tell you, staff generally has a rule that we don't give information out that city council doesn't have access to. So once we've sent it to city council, we will then kind of make it publicly available. We've only sent summary level information to council at this point. So I would love to get you that information, but I got to get it in front of the 9 first. And as soon as we do, we'll send it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Scott, I'm still kind of just stuck on the reality that there were far fewer applications than either anticipated or in comparison to maybe similar programs. And I wonder if there's space for this group to think about why on our end, but also get some insight into maybe why that might be and how we might approach that. If not for another round of applications, but for kind of future budgeting or future programs and next year, later this year, how we can maybe kind of change the calculus on that a little bit, because I agree it's a little not just surprising but disappointing almost to not see as much interest despite a lot of the marketing that's gone into the community communication. And especially if we see a dearth in maybe infrastructure type focus projects or a kind of demographic dearth from the application perspective, especially if we do have some new voices that are coming in, why are we not getting more interest?
It would be interesting to kind of figure out how to evaluate that correctly, probably going out doing some kind of focus groups of the people who did apply, trying to find folks who didn't. The 2 anecdotes I would give you are that 1, we were second in line here. I think there were a lot of applications at the county, and having applied to the county, ours is a little more, the second person, ours is a little more rigorous in nature in terms of what we asked for. Some of those peers, the county's was you could fill it out in about 15 or 20 minutes and be done with it. You would have had to have spent a good hour or 2 filling out our application. We asked a lot of questions about what you were going to do, how you were going to do it, your community partners. It was a much more intentional process to make sure that we were getting projects that were well thought out. So I do think in some of those other areas, the city of Greensboro had the same thing, a much shorter application. So I think ours was a little longer and a little more intense, particularly for some of the smaller jurisdictions. We got feedback that, man, this is something new to us. The other piece I would tell you is from the normal ones in the group that are much larger organizations that fill out grant opportunities all the time, we got feedback that, man, this is one of the most well-written, kind of documented sectional grants we've ever written. And so for the people who had grant writers in-house, it was a very straightforward process of, here's how you're going to be scored. This is exactly how you should answer it. For those that were smaller and didn't have the internal resources, I think they struggled to put together some of the information we asked for.
All right, well, then one of the things that I would love to see is either an attempt to make our process a little more consistent with, say Greensboro or the county, or, if there are funds available, then to steer it towards finding ways to facilitate a a more effective grant writing process for maybe organizations that don't have in-house grant writers or experience with that, right? A liaison process or a person to kind of help people move through that grant process. Because I like the idea of being rigorous and being thorough, but if it is a barrier to entry, then that's problematic, right? So if we are not finding ways to overcome that barrier, then something's got to shift in the other direction.
So I was actually going to suggest exactly what Tony just said, is that the smaller grants are having problems, maybe some money towards liaisoning with them, or, putting out, videos to help, for example. Though I will say an hour to put together and submit a grant proposal is frankly insanely small. I write grants all the time. I would be happy if I had a grant process that was an hour just to click the buttons. That's crazy. And though I'll say, actually, if you have enough proposals to fund, like at a 3 or 4, I mean, it sounds like you've got like 4 times as much money being asked for as we have. That to me sounds fine, honestly. I'm not too worried that there's not enough people applied if the success rate's only going to be around 25% as measured by money. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. I wish my grants had such high funding rates.
Yeah, Fred, what makes me nervous is that then when the numbers are reduced, then the baseline lowers a little bit too. So the last thing I want to see is grants going out for projects that don't have tangible success, right? So if we are, there's 50 grant applications and thus a higher percentage of them get approved despite the rigor, but then we don't have successful implementation and the funds aren't kind of visibly used in a way that, is consistent with the original vision, then those monies aren't really sitting there the next time around, right? So I just want to make sure that the program is not only robust in numbers, but in its success rate too. So making sure that either the numbers or the quality, or preferably both, kind of improve year to year.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, unless I don't know how the quality of the grant proposals are, but at some point, if you have too many, you more or less are it's a lot of it's luck as opposed to skill. And 25%, I think, is a pretty reasonable number. Because once I do this with NIH grants all the time, getting from 25% to 9% funding rate is usually a matter of luck more than just, are they actually good enough to be funded?
I will tell you that this is a great conversation, and one that we are constantly toiling with is how difficult should the application be? There are a lot of groups that do good work. I will tell you from a staff perspective, there were a lot of conversations about this. There were conversations about before the CBAC got this on their work plan, should there be a minimum threshold under which, you can't request less than 25,000 or less than 100,000, kind of weeding out some of the smaller organizations. The intent is not to get rid of a smaller organization. The intent in some places, and with the length of the application, I think we hit a sweet spot, hopefully. Part of this is you are potentially going to be a federal subrecipient, and you are going to be subject to federal uniform grant guidance. And if you are a one-person shop who has never managed a grant before, this is not the grant process for you. And so if you can't allocate an hour or 2 to filling out the grant application correctly, you are going to struggle significantly with the federal reporting guidelines, the procurement guidelines. And that gets back to that. We like to refer to it, Tony, as capacity building and assisting those partners. There is a level at which we don't have the resources to write the application with them and manage the project with them. And so we're kind of towing that very careful line of, if we're going to have federal subrecipients, we need to know that they've got administrative capacity to meet those grant guidelines. So we didn't want to be too cumbersome, but at the same time, we did want a small litmus test of being able to meet the minimum requirements. So that is, y'all are having a back and forth that staff has on a constant basis, not just with ARPA, but with our annual community agencies processes. Would love to get into the details of that. Maybe we put that as something to look at on a future work plan too. There are a lot of council members that would echo exactly what you said. Make it easier. Stop making it so difficult for us to fund the things that are actually creating outcomes in the community. So I'm going to keep moving down here to be respectful of time. We talked about marketing and reporting. Generally, I think from the advertising perspective, it didn't seem like there were a lot of questions why did we not use this kind of platform, or were there additional opportunities? Public input wise, again, we have those monthly meetings. If there are other things you'd like to see from a public input perspective, we could do that. I will stop here at bullet point 3 and say, I think this is a very ripe area for a recommendation for CBAC, which is that we should have some public facing dashboards related to how this ARPA money is being spent. I will tell you, we had a position that has gone unfilled now for about 3 months that was working on this, and we simply during budget process have kind of dropped this. So it would be very good to have a recommendation from CBAC saying budget needs to get back on the tab, get that position filled, and be producing the information about how this money is being used. And the storytelling component we also talked about. We really do need probably to spend a little more of this money before we do some significant storytelling, but I think that's probably 6 or 12 months down the road. Anything else generally in this area where you think it would be appropriate to have a discussion or a series of recommendations? Again, I would, as long as you allow me, I'm going to write one about those public facing dashboards. I think it's very appropriate for you to put that in front of City Council.
I like the dashboard idea as well, Scott.
Okay. I'm going to keep steaming along here then. Timing and administrative capacity. So let's talk for just a second about the period of performance. Again, we've talked about those December 31st dates in 24 and 26. 24 to be obligated, meaning we need to have an agreement or cut a purchase order by the end of 2024, and the entity's got to spend it by the end of 2026. Generally, the area that staff is going and council is going to have to work with is that's a pretty extensive 2-year period after the obligation ends. If we write an agreement in July of 2024 and we find out in January of 2025 that entity can't spend that funding, then we're out of luck. All of that money is going to get returned to the federal government because it will go as unobligated as of December 31st. There are some opportunities to go to the federal government and ask for the funds to be re-obligated. There's going to be a lot of guidance coming from the feds about that. But in terms of spending, it is in our best interest to spend this money as fast as we can before the end of 2024 so that we don't run into that issue of what happens if somebody had an obligation and then we have to de-obligate it. Our understanding right now is if we de-obligate funds in that 2-year period, they simply get returned to U.S. Treasury. We don't get an opportunity to re-obligate it. So.
Wow.
Hey, Seta, did you have a thought there?
I was just thinking how we could make sure that we spend the money that we have.
I think, again, thinking generally, this may be an opportunity for CBAC to say some of those programs that have longer spans, maybe have an inherent risk factor in them.
Right.
We recommend that you look at spending this money in the community more quickly so that you don't run into any de-obligation issues. That can just kind of be at a high level recommendation instead of specific dates or anything like that.
Right. I agree with that recommendation, as well as making sure that we have our administrative persons hired to make sure that they are able to look over the fundings, to make sure the grant recipients are actually doing what they said they're going to do and on timelines and all of that. So to prevent us from getting into that position.
That jumps down into that bottom bullet point. Fred, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to actually ask. So that sounds like there might need to be some project management expertise brought in to make sure this money is being spent in a timely fashion. Is that the administrative capacity positions you're talking about?
Precisely what that is. We have 2 positions in budget that are 100% would be 100% allocated to ensuring that all of the uniform grant guidance is met and for projects that are managed externally outside of budget. So all of the housing things are going to be done by our community development department. We would essentially have a second check to ensure community development is doing that correctly as an internal control and submitting all that appropriate paperwork to U.S. Treasury. I will tell you in the administrative capacity realm, the budget for 23 also includes, not funded by ARPA, additional positions in community development in anticipation of spending that 20 or $30 million in housing so that they do have the resources to dot their I's, cross their T's, and all that kind of stuff.
Very cool. I'm glad. So also about the period of performance, I don't know if this would be reasonable or not, but would it be reasonable to recommend that most of the money being spent during that first 2-year period? Like, because right, there's a period where they have to be obligated, then it has to be spent. Would it be unreasonable to ask to mostly spend projects that would be spent during that first time period so that you don't have to worry about it becoming deobligated? I still don't know if that's a reasonable recommendation, a reasonable thing to think about.
I think it is reasonable generally to suggest that as much of that money be spent as possible. I don't know that we'd be able to put a metric on it and say like 75% or 90% or something to that effect.
Well, I'm happy as much as possible. I just don't know if that's reasonable given timelines and
yeah, it will come specifically into 2 areas when you think about this. So when we give money to those nonprofit agencies, many of them suggest or requested multi-year funding. So they requested a program that they don't currently have spun up, but we would like you to fund it for 3 years. We could do a lot of 1 year and startup funding or 18-month funding of those programs and say, it's on you to find the money in year 2, like it would have been in year 4. We're going to make sure that we get you started. We like the idea, but you've got to get your resources online. I think it is very much in the realm to say that. In light of that, Fred, I'm going to drop down to the second bullet point and actually advance a slide and talk about something that we've hit on, but this is going to get kind of technical. And I definitely want people to raise your hands as we talk about this and say, hold on, wait, that doesn't make any sense to me. So ARPA versus local funding. Remember that roughly $32 million, it's 31.3 that we did the lost revenue calculation and it comes over to the general fund. That money doesn't actually have restrictions on it anymore.
Oh,
So the only real POP restricted money is the 20.5 million. I'm kind of circling with my cursor here, and I hope you guys can see that. This is a staff breakdown in theory of what might have the strings tied to it and what might not. This can change. We can move it around as projects come online and money spending happens. There are certain projects that have to be non-ARPA funded. When we did that city fund restoration to the ballpark fund and the convention center and such, that absolutely is not ARPA eligible. It has to be over here. The Weaver Fire, 99%, unless we find some other justification, really has to be over here. Eviction diversion, we actually have to put that 100,000 over here. It would be ARPA eligible, but we found out after inking the contract that we did not go through the federal procurement guidelines for this. So we were going to do the 100,000 out of general fund balance. Then we decided it to be ARPA eligible. Then we realized we didn't get the vendors online correctly. So that 100,000 has to be non-ARPA. We want the housing assistance money to be non-ARPA. That's not really a procurement issue. That's more of that timing issue, Fred. How quickly can we get some of those investments done? If we park it all here, then we don't have to worry about the period of performance. The rest of this is just kind of a net of the difference. So after you account for those things, there's only about, call that 4.5 million left. Everything else has to be ARPA related. And so that's kind of how we backed into this. You could make recommendations about, if there are specific programs you think, man, that I want you to do something else. 10 million of that, you should have no problem spending or obligating before 24 and 26. That frees up 10 million to be spent on something else kind of thing. I wanted to show you this at a kind of staff level perspective. I hope it's understandable and kind of how we're thinking about this. But this is also an area that you can make recommendations on what to use local funding for. This non-ARPA category really becomes eligible for, I'm going to say, anything, anytime. I mean, realistically. Now, we've obviously set aside some of that, the housing piece, and we're still showing it within the framework, but it could be proposed to be used within the framework or outside of the framework if it's not already obligated. So just a kind of a note there.
So just to clarify that almost 3 million under social and economic assistance, that's money that can be spent outside of those period of performance issues, right?
Yes.
So that could be for longer term, the
Yes.
multi-year funding instead of like the startup. Okay,
Yep.
cool.
So that's where I was getting to if we have some areas where we know we're not meeting the obligation, we can kind of switch between funding streams and say, okay, that one was ARPA funded. We're going to make it non-ARPA funded and spend the ARPA money faster. We have the opportunity to do that.
So, Scott, with that being said, with that digital divide, that 5 million there, could we take that? Since you said we can't, the city does not have the authority or the right to have a cable company to do any services or to provide services in rural areas. So since we don't have a partnership with our cable company or vendors, why can't we move that money into non-offer category so we can spend it?
Yeah, what I would say at the bottom line, whatever is in these columns, in these fields has to add up to 20.5 million, and whatever's in these has to add to 31.3. So if I move that money over there, I've got to take something over here and move it back.
Okay.
This is that 31,272,890 is the calculation that we were allowed to do by Treasury, and we cannot exceed that. I will say as a note, it requires us to do the calculation again for the next 2 years. And so it's possible for that number to go up a couple of more times, which is good for staff, good for everybody in the community, takes away the strings. We can use it potentially with higher eligibility and also don't have to do all of the same reporting on it. So that number 6 months from now, once our audit gets done, could go up.
Okay.
Yeah, but we can't just move something over without the offset moving it back.
Right.
But like you said, we were talking earlier that if that whole 5 million doesn't get used for digital divide, it could go back up into anything else over here, or
it just has to stay up on the ARPA.
Right. It would be very difficult. What I was saying in that second bullet, and this is kind of the technical piece, you can make a recommendation to take something over here and move it over here to free up money for something else if you wanted to. That would have less eligibility. There's just not a lot of opportunities to do
exactly
that.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and the fear for me would be then to create a program or to start an initiative that can't then be completed or followed up on once that ARPA money isn't necessarily what's readily available. So I would do so if we're jumping back and forth between columns there. I would do so only knowing that we're looking at, like, I would consider the short term versus the long term a little more carefully if we're going to do that.
Okay. So, like I said, just wanted to kind of show that. I know we talked about it before. Wanted to, at a summary level, kind of show that. Going back, these were kind of the areas that we had talked about, and I'll flash back all the way to the top as I think we've hit them in terms of the work plan. So, we kind of talked about the framework and funding uses. We just talked about period of performance and timelines. The administrative capacity, it seems like, you guys are on board with. We've added some positions and good in doing so, continue to maintain those positions. Talked about marketing and outreach, and we'll obviously have something about public facing dashboards. I think we've touched all of the ARPA level kind of areas. Does anybody have anything else that they were thinking about there that they'd like to put on City Council's radar as a group? Okay. The last piece in terms of recommendations is kind of this piece down here at the bottom, which is with a full work plan with ARPA, you still have the opportunity to make some recommendations. And this will bleed into talking about when the next meeting of CBAC needs to take place. You saw a trial balance budget that showed a 1.5 cent tax rate increase. I will say a trial balance budget is simply that. It can change in the month between that and when it goes to council, and often does. You saw that trial balance budget included a recycling fee for all residential recycling use of $2.50 per user per month as an availability fee for recycling. We'll note that generally fees are more regressive in nature then adding it to the property tax rate. So it could be well within your parameters to recommend putting something into the property tax rate rather than doing a regressive fee of sorts. There were kind of harkening back here, quite a substantial amount of funds, more than $5 million in one time allocated towards deferred maintenance projects, as well as we talked about potentially $50 million in lobs that might also be heavily used for maintenance. You could talk about or make a recommendation around, yes, we fully support infrastructure and asset maintenance as opposed to the development of new facilities kind of thing. So, and it could hammer street resurfacing was mentioned, could hammer street resurfacing, bridge replacement, recreation assets, think rec centers that are dilapidated, those kinds of things. So there are some kind of drafty things if you wanted to talk about at this level from what you heard from trial balance budget. And we will obviously come back to you with the manager's recommended budget and talk about the differences. I can tell you there are going to be a few differences, but I can't tell you what they are right now. Gotta stay tuned for another 3 weeks. That's how we keep you on the edge of your seat. But preliminary kind of recommendations from knowing a tax rate increase, the implementation of a new fee, significant reinvestment in assets via maintenance. Do you have any high level kind of support for those, or as we talked about the tax rate, maybe kind of not support for those? Would love to have those in draft form. Come back with the presentation of the manager's budget next time, talk about those draft recommendations and if they've changed based on the way the budget has changed.
I mean, the one thing that I've kind of come back to since our last meeting was the proposed recycling fee, right? I like the idea of going, in-house with the collection and everything. And I know that what precipitated all of this was the end of the original recycling contract. But fundamentally, if there's a fee attached, right there, I would imagine there'd be an expectation that there would be an improvement in our overall recycling service. So thinking about A, how we communicate that there could be an improvement, and B, thinking about, all right, if we are going to charge this fee and not have it, be offset by a property tax increase, really talking about how we're actually improving our recycling overall, right? Our capacity are we looking at a long-term plan that actually does increase our recycling capacity, which I think doesn't measure up well against, surrounding communities, for example. The original facility construction was in that original contract, limited, for example, our plastic recycling capacity compared to Guilford County. So I'm just wondering if we are going to be okay with that fee increase, or that the creation of a fee for municipal recycling, if there is plans, or if there are plans to actually improve our overall recycling capacity.
So I will tell you that the implementation of that fee or the increase in the property tax rate relative to the increased cost of the program are not going to be heavily marketed as an improvement to the program. This is literally here, the program is not changing in nature. What we would tell you is from moving it in-house, you might expect to see a little bit of improvement in the collection side. Helen would be working, whether it's contracted out or whether it's in-house and they are working on strategies to improve set out rates. But that fee would not be tied to any of our strategies for set out rates. That's something that we should just be working on anyway, and we are. But the fee is really just a cost recovery mechanism because of the significantly higher cost of providing the service.
Right, and that's what I figured. And if we were then going to look at more closely where that money comes from, be it fee or property tax, I think there is then a check mark in the column for, all right, maybe the fee is not necessarily the best recommendation, given that it's not accompanied by visually, for your average resident, accompanied by anything that is otherwise changing.
Well, how much would that increase the property taxes if it went into property taxes? Doesn't sound like much, but do you have an actual number?
So it would be in between 8 and 9/10 of a penny on the tax rate. So it would be a little less than a penny on the tax rate. And that depends on how big your house is, how much that's going to cost you. So in quick math, if you had a, let's say a $200,000 home at $100 per assessed value, oh Lord, that did not work on my calculator. Divided by 100. You'd be talking about your annual tax bill increasing roughly $18.
Yeah, that's what I got too.
The fee would be 30. Again, the regressive nature of that, if you owned $1 million home, you would be paying way more than $30 a month for that service.
I personally recommend, given what that whole discussion with Tony, that go to the property tax, that'd be less regressive, and it wouldn't make it seem like it's a sudden fee for doing nothing. So I personally think both the optics and the fairness would make it better as a property tax. Someone was going to say something.
Oh, it's just me, Fred. I was disagreeing with you that property tax is better than a monthly fee. I guess with me, I think our citizens are monthly feed out in so many ways, whether it be for food, whether it be for trying just the cost of living for housing. So another monthly fee from the city, I just don't think it will. I mean, yes, they would gripe and we eventually have to pay for it. But again, as long as we're providing a better service, keeping our recycling service in-house, I think we won't receive that much pushback from a tax rate versus a monthly fee. Because again, we're coming at the end of the year, the stormy season and the hurricane season, tornado season, and the changing of the weather altogether. People are really desperate and in need of just trying to get back to some sense of normalcy post-COVID. And so I don't think we should push so much on our citizens at one time.
I will also say, in full openness and transparency, it has been mentioned in front of City Council several times that there is the need in the not too distant future to increase stormwater rates.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks call them the rain tax. If you go back and watch the Public Works Committee first general agenda item from last night, you will see the major priority, high priority projects currently that the city is kind of embroiled in with respect to major culvert and sinkhole repair for stormwater issues. And there are tens of millions of dollars in projects in need. We have not raised the stormwater fee in 15 years. And we're not generating, in a cash flow perspective, the amount of money we need over time for the types of projects that are currently on the list. So with respect to fees, you could not recommend not implementing the recycling fee, also in light of the fact that there's probably a looming stormwater rate increase as well. Now, for the average residential customer, it's currently, I think, $4.50 a month. So, a 10 or 15% even increase in that, you're talking about 40 cents a month kind of thing. 50. So I don't know that there'd be a huge increase there. But would say, in light of the fee discussion, there is potentially another fee on the radar to be increased in the not too distant future.
But a fee that is attached to a general improvement of what the city is actually doing regarding stormwater, right?
Yes.
For the recycling thing, unless something's changing, that's a harder narrative.
Very much so, yes. Trying to rack my brains here, just generally. Again, I can go through that presentation if you have any questions. Those are kind of the high level policy decisions that are in the budget, in the trial balance budget as you saw it. There are some other things probably further below the line if we were doing a line item detail that I would call out to you, but you have seen all of the kind of major improvements and enhancements that we're talking about in this current budget. So there were, again, additional positions being added for abatement response crews. Those 4 people that we talked about, it's technically 3 in a reclassification in community development for all of the housing needs that we have, a language access coordinator position, specifically to work with Hispanic populations on outreach, that generally related to a growing population that we need to interact with and engage with, but also as a result of Weaver fire and emergencies. Yeah, Fred.
So that did remind me, I'm not sure if this is the time to bring it up, but I did want to make a recommendation that we investigate why there are so many unfilled firefighter positions. Remember that there were like 50 or so that were requested that weren't filled in the budget. I want to make it just to figure out, is that real or is it, what's going on there? Because that could be a serious impact on public safety, or it could just be an exaggeration, I guess. I mean, some investigation of
Shooting
that.
for the moon.
Exactly.
You're getting a small smile out of me. I've been working for the city for about 12 years and have been very close to fire all 12 of those years. Would tell you, I think, Fred, there's a little bit on both sides of that. I do think that there are some operational needs that need to be looked at in the fire department, in particularly as our leave policies have allowed for current firefighter positions to have more leave, that the production level of those is down a little bit. And the fire chief would tell you he needs a lot of additional capacity for additional stations and the like. So it's not a simple evaluation, but absolutely we'll include that in the recommendations to look at. And I do believe, as the budget director and someone who's been close to that budget for more than a decade, that there probably is a need to do something operationally in the fire department. I don't know that 56 is probably the number, but there are some needs there. Absolutely.
Okay, just to investigate that, because at first glance it looks scary.
It does. I will tell you, we are not taking fire engines out of service, so it's not at that level. But yeah, it does jump off the paper at you a little bit. The other piece would be, the fire department recommending or requesting 50 new positions. We do have 120 unfilled positions in the police department, so that may be kind of a higher level of public safety. That is, again, not something that we are experiencing that's significantly different than a lot of other jurisdictions. Durham's got 110 unfilled law enforcement officers. Raleigh's got about 160. I don't remember Charmec's number, but it was mind-blowing as well. That's kind of an indication of law enforcement more generally in large municipal areas. Not sure if you're interested in looking at that too. That's a kind of completely separate issue, but just want to throw that out there too as part of the conversation.
Scott, when is our next meeting?
So let us talk about that. Generally, we would schedule this out about a month into June, but as we get closer to the manager's recommended budget is going to be released on the 31st. To city council. So I would recommend that we meet and talk about the manager's recommended budget and solidify some recommendations, either the 1st or the 8th. And then the chair and or vice chair could come to a finance committee that following week and do a very short presentation on kind of your recommendations. So I would.
It'd be the same time on the afternoon of the 1st or the 8th?
You could pick the time. 2 o'clock is generally what we do on a Wednesday, but if you wanted to do something 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, we could make ourselves available as needed.
I can do either of those dates if it's the afternoon.
Same
here.
No problem.
Okay.
How if we move for June 1st, 2 p.m.?
Yeah, as long as it works from Jamesina's work perspective. I don't want to have I want her to have to dual wield.
So now you said this is, give me that date one more time.
June 1st.
June 1st.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a Wednesday. And we're looking at, you said we would either keep 2 o'clock or we could move to a 3 or a 4.
We could.
Okay. That is after our last day of school in my district. So that's a plus. It is not, I can do any of those times on June 1st. I would be at work, of course, but but it's a lot more slow that week because our Our students graduate on May 27th.
All right. Well, let's plan for June 1st at 2:00. We
Okay.
will look at kind of the draft recommendations related to ARPA as I get them together. We will talk about the manager's recommended budget and any recommendations you might have related to operating and capital budgets. Solidify, hopefully, that and allow you to approve it pending kind of edits and changes. If we have substantial changes, then we might try and reschedule something again on the 8th, just as a 15-minute meeting to do an official vote and approval of a report.
Okay.
Sound good to everybody?
Okay,
Yes.
sounds
All
good.
right.
All
Fantastic.
right. Well,
Thank you.
we hit all of that. I will tell you what I'll put on the agenda for next time. Just a quick run through. We've talked about this. The city council should be approving this coming Monday the opportunity for all public boards and commissions that don't actually have contract letting authority to meet virtually in perpetuity if they choose. So hopefully on the next agenda, we'll have an item for you to vote on, not having to come back in person if you don't want to, which I assume it's easier for everybody to do virtually. Okay.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, all.
Thank
All right.
you.
Everyone have a great afternoon.
All right. Thank you. You too, Scott.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.